In the flickering glow of candles, a tiny princess walked through a chapel far too grand for her little steps. She was only 5 years old, yet a crown was placed upon her head, and vows of marriage were whispered into the air. Too young to understand, too fragile to carry the burden of kingdoms, before she could even grow into her titles, death silenced her at the age of 8. This is not merely history, it is a story of innocence stolen, of power devouring childhood. This is the forgotten tragedy of Anne de Mowbray, England's child bride. On December 10th, 1472, in the cold heart of winter, Framlingham Castle in Suffolk echoed with a sound it was not built for, the cry of a newborn child. The castle, with its red-bricked walls, deep moat, and towers standing like guardians of power, had been designed for war, for lords and soldiers. Yet that morning, it became the cradle of Anne de Mowbray, the little girl destined to be England's most tragic child bride. Her mother, Elizabeth Talbot, held her close, whispering prayers of thanks, her face lit with both relief and love. For Elizabeth, Anne was a gift from God, fragile yet precious. Her father, John de Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, stood with pride, seeing not only a daughter, but the continuation of a powerful dynasty. She was more than a child from the moment she was born. She was hope, inheritance, and the promise of legacy. The nursery was warm compared to the cold winds outside. A great fire blazed in the hearth, casting light over wooden toys, embroidered cloths, and the soft cradle where Anne slept. Nurses sang lullabies, their voices mingling with the crackle of flames. Anne's world was simple: the smell of beeswax, the comfort of silks, the sight of sunlight sneaking through narrow windows. She giggled at the barking of hounds, clutched little dolls carved by servants, and chased shadows across the floor. To her, Framlingham was not a fortress, but a playground. But fate has no mercy for innocence. In 1476, when Anne was only 4 years old, her father died suddenly. With his death, unimaginable wealth and vast estates fell upon her tiny shoulders. Overnight, she was no longer simply a child. She became Duchess of Norfolk, Countess of Surrey, and Baroness Mowbray. Too small to lift even a toy crown, she was now the richest heiress in England. In council chambers, men whispered her name not with tenderness, but with calculation. Ambassadors weighed her as if she were a treaty, a solution, a prize. To them, she was not the laughing child who loved dolls and songs, but property, land, titles, and gold wrapped in the body of a little girl. Childhood, before it could bloom, was already being taken from her. And so, as Anne's toys gathered dust and the weight of titles pressed onto her tiny shoulders, whispers in the council chambers grew louder. Men who had never seen her cradle a doll spoke of her as if she were a treaty. To them, Anne de Mowbray was no longer a little girl. She was opportunity. By 1477, King Edward IV had fixed his gaze upon her. Hardened by years of the Wars of the Roses, Edward was a man who knew the fragility of crowns. He had won battles, seized thrones, and crushed enemies, but he also knew that wars could erupt again. Victory on the battlefield was never enough. To secure his dynasty's survival, Edward needed land, wealth, and alliances that could outlast swords. Anne, just 5 years old, embodied all three. She was the sole heiress of the vast Mowbray inheritance, estates stretching across Norfolk, Suffolk, and beyond. Her titles carried not only honor, but political influence that could shield the Yorkist throne. If his young son, Richard of Shrewsbury, married her, the riches of the Mowbrays would be bound forever to the royal house. But there was a barrier. Canon law forbade children so young from marrying. At 5 and 4, Anne and Richard were far below the acceptable age. For most, this would have been the end of the plan. For Edward, it was only an obstacle. He knew the true power of kingship was not in swords alone, but in bending rules. He turned to Rome. Letters were sent, petitions written, and bribes discreetly offered. On May 12, 1477, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal dispensation. With the stroke of a quill, what was once impossible became law. A 5-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy were now betrothed under the blessing of the Church. The court rejoiced. Courtiers whispered of Edward's brilliance, ambassadors praised his strategy. To them, it was genius. The king had secured not just wealth, but also the authority of Rome. But far away, in her chamber, Anne sat with her dolls, unaware that her future had already been sold. The morning of January 15, 1478, dawned cold and gray, but inside Westminster, the air shimmered with anticipation. St. Stephen's Chapel, a jewel of architecture, had been transformed into a stage of splendor. Rich tapestries depicting saints and battles covered the stone walls. Dozens of candles flickered in golden holders, their flames dancing in the draught of the vast hall. The choir rehearsed soft hymns, and the sound echoed like a haunting reminder that this was not a coronation, nor a victory parade. It was a marriage. Into this scene stepped Anne de Mowbray, a child of only 5 years. Her gown, heavy with silks and embroidery, nearly swept the floor, hiding her tiny steps. Her face, pale and serious, was framed by a veil that seemed far too solemn for her age. In her small hands, she clutched a posy of winter flowers, the petals trembling as much as her fingers. She was guided forward, not as a child being led to play, but as a duchess to the altar. At her side was Richard of Shrewsbury, just 4 years old. His velvet cap slid slightly over his brow as he shuffled nervously. An attendant whispered to him where to stand, when to bow, what to repeat. His eyes darted, curious and anxious, as he looked around at the sea of faces staring back at him. The priest began the ceremony. The Latin words, heavy with centuries of tradition, rang out in the vast space. Words meant for men and women, words of duty, honor, and union, now spoken over 2 children barely beyond the nursery. Anne repeated her lines softly, her voice barely audible. Richard fumbled with his gloves, dropping one to the floor, causing a ripple of muffled laughter among courtiers, before silence reclaimed the room. When the vows were finished, the trumpets blared. The chapel shook with sound as nobles applauded politely. To history, a marriage had been recorded. To the king, it was victory, a political masterpiece. But to Anne and Richard, it was incomprehensible. They were too young to understand they had just traded away the last pieces of their innocence. After the vows were spoken and the trumpets silenced, Anne's life entered a new chapter, though she was far too young to understand it. No longer was she just a child in a nursery. She was now the Duchess of Norfolk, bound by a marriage arranged not for love, but for power. The palaces she lived in became her playground and her prison all at once. Every morning, her maids dressed her in gowns so heavy with embroidery that her little body swayed under their weight. Jewels were placed upon her head, shoes of fine leather on her feet. She was taught how to walk slowly, gracefully, as though every step were part of a stage performance. Tutors instructed her in French phrases, Latin prayers, and the endless etiquette of the court. Even her laughter was corrected, reshaped into a polite smile fit for ceremonies. At times, small bursts of childhood broke through. Richard of Shrewsbury would sneak into her chambers with a toy or a jest. Together, they would run through long cloisters, giggling until a stern voice scolded them back into roles they never chose. For those fleeting minutes, they were children again. But the echo of footsteps always ended their joy. Anne often gazed through the palace windows at the gardens below. She longed to run barefoot on the grass, to chase butterflies like village girls she sometimes glimpsed. Yet the gardens, though close, were untouchable, symbols of a freedom she could never taste. She was admired, paraded, whispered about as treasure of the crown. But inside, She was a child trapped in a gilded cage. The walls shone with gold, but the doors were locked tight. As months turned into years, Anne's childhood was quietly stolen away, not by time, but by power. The dolls that once filled her nursery now lay untouched, covered in dust at the back of a shelf. The nursery itself was replaced with chambers decorated in velvet and gold. Her laughter, once unrestrained and pure, was reshaped into quiet, polite smiles, practiced in front of a mirror under the watchful eyes of governesses. Each day began with ceremony. A lady-in-waiting would enter with a curtsy and announce the morning routine. Servants dressed her in gowns heavier than her tiny frame could bear. Instead of ribbons and playthings, she wore brooches, pendants, and miniature crowns. Rings too large slid awkwardly on her fingers, symbols of wealth that weighed more heavily than any toy. Even the way she walked was rehearsed, a careful glide across marble floors, not the free-spirited run of a child. Lessons filled her hours. French tutors drilled her on grammar and pronunciation. Priests taught her Latin prayers, ensuring she could recite them flawlessly at ceremonies. Noblewomen instructed her in deportment, how to curtsy at the right angle, how to lower her eyes in humility, how to rise with dignity. There was no time for play, no room for childish mistakes. Every gesture was a performance, every word a test. Courtiers admired her from a distance, whispering of her fortune and her titles. What a treasure, they said, to hold such lands and wealth at so young an age. To them, she was not a child, but property, estates wrapped in the body of a girl. Visitors came not to see her smile, but to measure her worth. She was spoken of as one might speak of a jewel, or a piece of land, or a chest of gold. At times, Anne resisted in small, fragile ways. She tugged at her heavy gowns, wishing for freedom. She clung to a doll when told to put it aside. She tried to hide behind curtains when lessons grew too long, but every attempt was met with the same stern reminder. You are a duchess now. Slowly, her will to resist faded. She learned to stay still, to obey, to nod politely. The child inside her, the one who once giggled at shadows and chased beams of sunlight, was disappearing. What remained was a young duchess, bound by duty, burdened by expectation. Her childhood had not simply ended, it had been erased, sacrificed at the altar of politics. By the year 1480, shadows of concern began to spread across the corridors of Greenwich Palace. Anne de Mowbray, once paraded as the jewel of England, now looked frail. The color that once brightened her cheeks faded to a pale hue. Her laughter, already rare, grew almost extinct. Whispers floated among the servants. The little duchess is not well. Physicians were summoned from London and beyond. Learned men carried their leather satchels filled with remedies, powders of crushed herbs, syrups of honey, ointments infused with strange spices. They prescribed tonics to balance her humors, believing illness was caused by an imbalance in the body. They bled her, fed her bitter concoctions, prayed over her bedside. Each promised recovery, yet none succeeded. Anne would sit in her chamber, wrapped in blankets embroidered with golden threads, her small hands shivering despite the warmth. Beeswax candles flickered around her bed, their steady flames contrasting with the uncertainty of her life. At times, she tried to smile when Richard of Shrewsbury visited, bringing a toy horse or a bunch of flowers from the garden. His childish attempts to cheer her lit her face briefly, but the light faded as quickly as it came. Her mother, Elizabeth Talbot, remained constantly at her side. She brushed her daughter's hair, whispered lullabies from the days of her infancy, and prayed to saints for mercy. Each time Anne coughed, Elizabeth's heart sank deeper. She begged physicians for answers, but they offered little more than rituals and guesses. The Duke's widow, once proud and regal, was now simply a mother watching her child slip away. The palace grew quieter. Courtiers, once bustling with ambition, now walked softly past her chambers. Conversations fell into whispers, as though loud voices might shatter what little strength she had left. Priests came daily, blessing her bed, filling the air with Latin prayers and the smoke of incense. The sweet scent hung heavy, mingling with the bitter odor of medicines that failed to cure. Anne grew weaker with each passing month. She could no longer join Richard in play. She lay in bed, gazing at the ceiling, asking quiet questions. Will there be gardens in heaven? Or do angels sing lullabies? Questions no physician could answer, only her mother, who stroked her hair and said softly, "Yes, my child, yes." By late 1481, her condition worsened. Her steps grew unsteady, her voice barely above a whisper. At times she drifted into restless sleep, muttering half-remembered prayers. To those who watched, it was clear. The jewel of England was fading like a candle burning too quickly. By the autumn of 1481, the weight of silence hung heavily over Greenwich Palace. The once bustling corridors grew quieter near Anne's chambers, as though the very walls held their breath. Servants tiptoed, afraid that even the sound of their footsteps might disturb her fragile peace. Candles burned day and night around her bed, their golden flames constant, yet each flicker felt like a reminder of how precarious her life had become. Anne lay upon a bed too large for her small body, covered in silken sheets embroidered with golden thread. Her hands, once full of energy and play, now trembled as they clutched the edge of her blanket. She coughed softly, the sound echoing in the stillness. Her once bright eyes were dimmed, but not empty. They carried a wisdom far too old for a girl of 8. Her mother, Elizabeth Talbot, rarely left her side. She prayed at her bedside, whispered stories of saints, and stroked her daughter's hair with trembling fingers. Sometimes she sang the same lullabies she had hummed when Anne was an infant, as if she could hold back time with song. Each lullaby was half a prayer, half a farewell. Richard of Shrewsbury visited often. He was only a child himself, and though he did not fully understand death, he sensed its shadow. He would bring her gifts, a carved wooden horse, a handful of daisies plucked from the gardens. He placed them gently beside her pillow, whispering, "Get well soon, Nan." Anne would try to smile at him, her lips curving faintly, her eyes filled with affection. For a moment it seemed as if the illness loosened its grip, but it never lasted. Priests came daily, chanting Latin hymns, blessing her with holy water, filling the chamber with the scent of incense. Courtiers stood outside, murmuring prayers, some out of genuine grief, others perhaps out of fear for what her death might mean for alliances and estates. Yet within that room, politics melted away. There was no duchess, no heiress, no bride. There was only a child, fading too soon. On the evening of November 19th, 1481, the sky outside grew dark, and the River Thames flowed silently as if in mourning. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with sorrow. Anne whispered a final prayer, her voice no louder than the rustle of her sheets. Her mother leaned close, holding her hand, tears falling freely. Richard sat quietly at the foot of the bed, clutching the little toy horse he had once given her. Anne's breathing slowed. Each breath grew shallower, her chest rising and falling like a candle flame in the wind. Finally, in the arms of her mother, with prayers whispered over her, she slipped into stillness. She was only 8 years old. The silence that followed was deafening. A child's voice, once full of promise, was gone. Greenwich Palace, for all its grandeur, was drowned in grief. The jewel of England had been extinguished, a flame too delicate to survive the storm. The news of Anne's death spread quickly through the corridors of Greenwich and beyond. What had once been whispers of concern turned into cries of grief. Messengers carried the sorrow to Westminster, to the guild halls of London, and to noble households across the realm. The jewel of England, The Duchess, who had barely lived, was gone. Preparations for her funeral began immediately. Though she was only 8 years old, she was a duchess, a bride, an heiress. Her funeral had to reflect her titles, even if her life had been too short to wear them fully. Tailors stitched mourning clothes, choirs rehearsed solemn hymns, and priests prepared the Latin rites. The air of Westminster grew heavy with anticipation, not of joy, but of sorrow. On the appointed day, the bells of Westminster Abbey tolled slowly, each strike echoing across London like the heartbeat of grief. Courtiers dressed in long black gowns lined the streets, their faces somber. Candles flickered in the gray morning light, their flames struggling against the cold drafts. Anne's coffin, small and lined with lead, was carried by solemn hands. It was draped with cloth of gold and embroidered with her titles, Anne, Duchess of York. Though the coffin was light, the weight of sorrow it carried pressed heavily on all present. Behind it walked her mother, Elizabeth Talbot, veiled in black, her steps slow and trembling. She clutched a rosary, whispering prayers through her tears. Richard of Shrewsbury followed as well, the little boy confused by the gravity of the moment. In his small hands, he clutched the wooden toy horse he had once given Anne. His eyes, wide and uncertain, scanned the crowd. He could not yet understand death, but he knew something precious had been taken from him. As the procession entered Westminster Abbey, the grandeur of the place magnified the sorrow. The vaulted ceilings caught the mournful notes of the choir, and the scent of incense filled the vast space. Priests chanted, their voices rising like waves of lament. Nobles knelt in silence, some weeping openly, others bowing their heads in private prayer. When the coffin was lowered into the chapel of St. Erasmus, flowers were scattered. Wax dripped from tall candles, falling like tears onto the cold stone floor. The final prayers were spoken, and the earth claimed the little duchess. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, as though the abbey itself mourned with those gathered. But time does not stop. Seasons changed, kings rose and fell, wars came and went. Anne's coffin was later moved to Stepney. Her name, once whispered with calculation in council chambers, grew faint. Generations passed, and she became little more than a line in a record, a forgotten footnote in the chronicles of England. Centuries passed, and the world moved on. The Wars of the Roses gave way to the Tudors to the Stuarts, and the Stuarts to monarchs yet to come. England changed. London grew into a sprawling city of trade, wealth, and empire. The cries of market sellers filled the streets where once messengers had carried news of Anne's short life and early death. The abbey where she had been buried welcomed the coronations of kings and queens, the marriages of royals, and the funerals of the great. Yet in the midst of this grand history, Anne's name faded. To most, she became little more than a line in a genealogy chart, a forgotten figure whose only legacy was that she had been married as a child and died before she could ever grow into the titles thrust upon her. Generations passed, and her story became dust upon forgotten parchment, tucked away in archives that few cared to open. The world remembered Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower. It remembered Edward IV, Elizabeth Woodville, and the battles of the Roses. But Anne? Anne disappeared into silence. Until 1964. In Stepney, East London, workmen were clearing the remains of an old convent site, once tied to the abbey. As they dug into the ground, their shovels struck something solid. Removing the earth carefully, they uncovered an arched brick vault. Inside was a small coffin, its shape unmistakable. It had been made for a child. When they brushed away the dirt, they found a lead plate. Upon it was inscribed a name, Anne, Duchess of York. The discovery sent ripples through England. Historians gathered, scholars wrote reports, newspapers carried the story. After nearly 5 centuries of silence, the child bride of England had been found again. People who had never heard her name read about her in headlines. The tragedy of Anne de Mowbray resurfaced, a haunting reminder of innocence stolen for power. In 1965, she was reburied at Westminster Abbey, close to the place she had first been mourned. The service was private, but solemn. Candles glowed once more around her coffin. Priests spoke the ancient words of prayer. In that moment, history seemed to bend back upon itself. The same abbey that had witnessed her funeral centuries earlier now welcomed her again, this time with reverence for the story she carried. Today, thousands of tourists pass through Westminster Abbey each year. They marvel at the tombs of kings, the grandeur of monuments, the weight of history etched into every stone. Few notice the resting place of a child duchess who lived only 8 years. Fewer still pause to wonder what her life must have been like, or what her death meant for those who loved her. And yet her presence remains there, silent, enduring, a fragile thread in the tapestry of England's story. Anne's rediscovery is not just about one girl. It is about all children who were sacrificed on the altar of politics and power. She stands as a symbol of innocence, crushed by ambition. Her story forces us to remember that behind every crown, every title, and every treaty, there are human lives, fragile lives, often too young to bear the weight thrust upon them. In remembering Anne, history lights a candle in the dark. Her voice, silenced too soon, still whispers across the centuries. No empire, no kingdom, no ambition is worth the price of a stolen childhood.